On behalf of IFAC, it is my big pleasure to welcome representatives of professional accountancy organizations, regulators, firms, practitioners, and other stakeholders from Europe and Central Asia, as well as other regions. It is also our big pleasure to co-host this event with our long-standing partner, the WorldBank, and its Center for Financial Reporting Reform. We thank them for ongoing collaboration and for organizing this event. And I guess on behalf of many of you for facilitating wider access to this event through providing interpretation and pre-event translation of the materials. The new quality management standards we're going to discuss today represent an important fundamental shift from quality control approach to quality management approach. The shift that we believe will raise the bar for quality within firms and on engagements, the overall quality of audit, and drive confidence and trust in the accountancy profession, and confidence, trust in our economies and functioning of our markets. Adoption and implementation of the new standards at the national level will require a joint coordinated efforts. And we are happy to see today a lot of interest in this topic from different groups of stakeholders, with many representatives from most of the countries in the region and beyond joining us now. Today, we are delighted to have with us representatives of the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, distinguished experts who will help you and your organization understand the new requirements and help us all start planning for the upcoming important change. IFAC and its partner organizations stay committed to assisting you in the process. And without taking more of your time, I am pleased to welcome Daniel Boyce, Practice Manager for Europe and Central Asia, Governance Global Practice of the WorldBank. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Maria, and welcome everyone. I see the participant numbers going up, more than 600 now joining us. And so I'd like to welcome everyone to this joint IFAC and WorldBank webinar. The participant interest is beyond Europe and Central Asia, although that's the focus of our group and our Center for Financial Reporting in Vienna that's organizing this session with IFAC, but we welcome people from all over the world who are joining this with the interest in hearing about the new standards. I think from the perspective of corporate financial reporting, these new international standards on quality management, the ISQMs, are important, and they come at a time when there's quite a high demand for quality financial statements and also respectively for the quality of audits. We're glad to have this event delivered jointly with IFAC, and it's great that our clients are able to hear directly from the source of the people who are working on these standards to be able to learn directly from them. We understand that the quality management goes deeper than quality control, and that's the change in terminology that comes with the new standards that are really meant to move the discussion from the management of quality to really the heart of the audit firm's strategy, and then through to its operations and the conduct of its staff. We believe that the new standards would equip the profession overall with a robust and scalable and more proactive approach to audit quality management that's essential to serving not only the clients, but the public interest as a tool for building trust in financial information that is either in markets or just being emitted being sent out to the markets and to investors and to other stakeholders. As you may know, the World Bank is supporting corporate financial reporting reforms in various jurisdictions. We use various different instruments, often with support from development partners, and often sometimes within our own operations. And the quality of audits is one of the most important pillar of those reforms. And of course, we also expect all of our development projects to be audited, and we often depend on the profession for the quality of those audits. We'll continue to support the activities that would enhance the quality of audits and implicitly the quality of the financial statements. We see some other potential areas of development assistance that could support in the adoption and implementation of these new standards. It could include, although not limited to these types of activities, but training of trainers, something that we often support, support for capacity building of PAOs and public audit oversight regulators, and then support to adapt the quality assurance methodologies in line with the provisions of the new standards. Then I guess going out to all the participants, I want to encourage you to raise your questions today. This is your chance to get your questions out before we get closer to implementation of the standards. I think this will help also to identify areas where there might be some additional technical assistance required in your countries or across countries to ensure that the new quality management standards are really properly implemented once they become effective in December 2022. Finally, the overall aim of the World Bank and IFAC joint activities is to promote standards that are intended to enhance the risk-based quality management, global consistency given the global reach of both agencies, and also set the foundation for high-quality audits across the auditing profession. So I wish everyone a productive discussion, and I look forward to hearing the presentations myself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Much appreciated. Important and very much needed work that the World Bank and the Center are doing in the region, and very happy to hear you plan to support adoption and implementation of the standards, of the new standards. And now moving to the main part of our discussion, we are very fortunate to have here with us Sue Almond, IAASB Board Member and member of the ISQM 1 Task Force, and Natalie Klonaridis, Deputy Director of the IAASB. Both Sue and Natalie live and breathe the new standards, intimately know them, having been involved in their development. I also do encourage all of you to take advantage of this opportunity, seek clarifications and answers to your questions. During the presentation, we will pause several times for questions and answers, moderated by Pascal Frère-Jacques, Senior Operations Officer of the CFRR of the World Bank. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function, not the chat, including questions in other languages, and we will address them during the Q&A session. Just a reminder that the links to the translated slides, you can find those in the chat. And now, Sue, Natalie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria. Thank you, Daniel, for the welcome. And we are delighted to be with you today for this very important session. As Maria said, my name is Sue Almond. I am an IAASB board member. I'm halfway through my second year as a board member and a member of the ISQM 1 task force. I am also Global Head of Assurance at Grant Thornton International. So we are working very hard with our member firms, both large and small firms, on ISQM 1 implementation. So I imagine I am probably dealing daily with many of the practical issues that you are all facing as well. Natalie, would you like to say a few words to introduce to the group?
Great, thank you, Sue, and good morning, everybody, from a very warm and sunny New York. I'm Natalie Klonaridis. I'm a Deputy Director here at the IAASB. I was very involved with the ISQM 1 project. I was responsible for the project since 2016 and saw it through to the end, through to it getting published. So certainly very impressive today to see the broad representation we have globally on this webinar. So just really thanking everybody for joining us to hear more about this topic. Back to you, Sue.
Thank you. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, we will start by looking at the quality management standards. Thank you. So we're going to speak about the quality management standards, and I'm going to be referring to this as this suite of standards that you can see here: ISQM 1, ISQM 2, and ISO 220 revised. So that's what we mean by the quality management standards. And these standards address the management of quality by the firm, as well as the management of quality on individual engagements. The IAASB determined the need to develop and revise the quality management standards through a number of information gathering and outreach activities over many years, dating back to 2013. And I'm sure some of you will remember the invitation to comment and some of the other outreach that was undertaken. These activities highlighted a number of critical issues that we took into account in developing the standards, including a need to improve firm governance and leadership and the culture and tone at the top to deliver quality, to address the emergence of new trends, for example, in how firms communicate with their stakeholders, and just generally to modernise the standards for things that had been learnt in the whole quality management process. Also to consider networks. Many firms belong to networks and receive material from that network, but recognising that networks come in very different sizes and structures. Mine's quite a large one. There are plenty of others that are different, and they provide different services. But there was a concern about firms placing undue reliance on what they get from networks, and without necessarily considering the service or the material they were given in the context of their own circumstances. Something that has already come out through the questions that have been submitted online is the challenges experienced by smaller firms in applying the standards in practice. And other areas are around strengthening the engagement partners' responsibilities and improving the robustness of a number of aspects of engagement quality control reviews. So we believe that the new standards have raised the bar on quality management. And as Maria said, we're using the term quality management very specifically rather than quality control, because this is a big shift to a more proactive, more forward-looking approach. The IAASB believes that the new quality managements will deliver greater confidence and trust, and that we've been responsive to the issues we've been hearing from key stakeholders. The standards have been modernised to take into account emerging trends, technology, and really reflect a fresher approach to managing quality. COVID-19 has impacted that, and actually I feel that many firms have been having to adapt their quality management in much more of an ISQM1 way of doing things to help them deliver consistent quality with all the challenges that we've had under the COVID-19 environment. And we think that the quality management standards move the bar. The standards are more robust than the current standards, and they've got a more improved focus on the effectiveness of how firms and engagement partners manage quality. So as you can see on the slide, the quality management standards comprise three interrelated standards. ISQM1 is the firm level standard, so it's directed at the firm and it deals with the firm's responsibility for quality through having a system of quality management at that firm level. The system is necessary because it's the mechanism that creates an environment that enables and supports engagement teams to perform quality engagements. It's got broad applicability to all firms who perform engagements under the IAASB standards. So that includes firms who perform audits or reviews of financial statements, other assurance engagements, compilations, or agreed upon procedures. So if a firm provides any of these services, then ISQM1 applies. It's not whether they provide all, but if they provide any of those. And ISQM1 replaces the IAASB's current standard, ISQC1, which was focused more on quality control as opposed to quality management. And we will probably come back to that several times in the presentation. ISQM2 is a brand new standard, that deals with engagement quality reviews. So this is really taking the position of, once you know that you need to have a quality reviewer, what does that mean? Although this is a brand new standard, many elements of this standard are familiar, as they've been relocated from other existing standards, in particular ISQC1 and ISO 220. And then ISO 220, which is a revision of an existing standard, applies to individual audits. So it's audits of financial statements. And so that takes the environmental considerations and applies them to the individual audits. So it addresses how quality is managed at the engagement level by the engagement partner. And ISO 220 builds on ISQM1 in that the system of quality management forms the foundation for the management of quality. And then ISO 220 deals with how the engagement partner leverages the firm's system and manages quality at the engagement level. And as I said at the beginning, ISO 220 revised is based on the existing ISO 220 with additional material. Can we move to the next slide, please? So this is the timeline for the quality management standards. This timeline has been getting shorter as more has been delivered and as we get closer to the implementation date. As we've already mentioned, the quality management standards were approved by the IAASB in September 2020. They were officially released in December 2020. They are available on the IAASB's website. And that was after the IAASB's oversight, the Public Interest Oversight Board, had approved the due process in developing the standards. The standards become effective in December 2022. That means that under ISQM1, the firm's systems need to be designed and implemented by December 2022 and ready to start operating from that date. For audit engagement and the engagement quality control reviews for those engagements, the engagements will need to be performed under the new standards for financial years beginning on or after the 15th of December 2022. We are developing implementation support materials, which we expect will be issued by the end of this month. And we're also planning a series of 4 videos, which was announced yesterday, actually, in the 3rd quarter of this year, which will be deeper dives into different aspects of the new standards. And Natalie will provide a bit more information about those shortly. Can we move to the next slide, please? So what I'm going to do is take a deeper look into ISQM1, which deals with the firm's responsibilities to have a system of quality management. Next slide, please. So, as I already mentioned, ISQM1 replaces the IAASB's current standard, which is ISQC1. And the changes to this standard are fundamental. This really is a big change in how we are looking at quality management. As we've already said, there's a real shift from a focus on quality control, which I would tend to see as a more backward-looking activity, to quality management, which is more forward-looking, more proactive. And that change is deliberate because we want to make sure that firms are being proactive and that they're applying a risk-based approach to managing the risks to quality. That's different to a more policies and procedures approach that we perhaps have now. And it recognises the individual position of the firm itself. We also recognise that information flows through the system and can drive continuous improvement. So if there are findings or deficiencies, there needs to be appropriate remediation. And what we are looking at here is building in opportunities for continuous learning and improvement. Another big change is the risk-based approach, which will be familiar to auditors because that's how we plan and undertake our work in any event. And that also really facilitates a tailored and scalable system for all sizes of firms. We hear consistently from small and medium practices about the challenges in application and recognise that the standard needs to cover the full range of firms. So larger firms need to scale up, and there needs to be opportunities for smaller firms to scale down. The risk-based approach is really focused on what could go wrong, taking into account the nature and the circumstances of the firm and the engagements that it performs. So the outcome could be significantly different for a small firm that only undertakes, say, review or agreed upon procedures assignments, to a large firm that's got a focus on listed company audit market and more complex entities. So the risk-based approach really allows the scaling up or down to be used by the different sizes of firm. As the quite complex diagram on the slide shows, the system encompasses many different components. Some of those components are very similar to what exists in ISQM, ISQC1 today, but there is a key difference, and that's that the new standard really drives a more iterative and integrated approach to managing quality, whereby the firm looks at the system as a whole and thinks about what they need rather than focusing on the individual elements. So it recognises that there are dependencies between the different components and how they affect each other. The IAASB believes that the combination of changes in the standard will be transformative for firms. I think an important point to keep in mind is that given the incorporation of the new elements, there's a real likelihood that the standard could affect areas or functions within the firms that are not typically directly involved in audits. And by that, I mean things like the firm's IT function or the human resources function. And those activities could impact the quality on audits. So one of the things certainly that I'm finding in practice is the need to engage more widely with some of the other teams within the firms to address some of the broader areas. And we'll come back to that in a minute when we talk about governance and leadership. As firms prepare for their implementation, they need to consider carefully how they're going to manage the change, probably more so than any other standard issued by the IAASB, because this gets to the heart of how a firm is run and how it operates. So, for example, things like thinking about the commitment of leadership to quality, thinking about whether there's any organisational restructuring needed to be able to deliver the quality management system that's needed. How the firm circulates the information and changes that are going on throughout the firm, whether it's from the firm outwards to its stakeholders or from individual engagement teams inwards to the individuals who are charged with quality management, and how's that going to happen within the firm? Whether there's going to be investment needed, for example, in systems. I can see we've got a question about practice management software, and those are the kinds of things that firms may need to be thinking about, whether there may need to be investment in those kind of things, or service providers to help in certain positions, and whether there are any other resource needs that are going to be necessary for implementing this changed quality management approach. If we move to the next slide, I'm going to talk about the governance and leadership, because this was one of the key public interests that the IAASB focused on when we were developing the standard. And the reason for that is really linking to some of the corporate failures that have raised fundamental questions about the relevance and quality of audits and the firm leadership role there. And also that the IAASB views governance and leadership as a critical foundation for the system. If the firm's leadership isn't committed to quality and taking action to cascade a culture of quality throughout the firms, then that creates an unstable environment for the system, and individual commitment is in danger of being overridden. The IAASB was also really aware that since ISQC1 was originally issued, there have been a lot of changes and improvements in corporate governance, and a lot of learnings that we've built on, with a move from a more compliance approach to more quality management, And for example, we have audit firm governance codes in existence in a number of jurisdictions that we're able to draw on, and they focus very much on the leadership role. So the new standard much more robustly addresses the roles and responsibility of leadership in relation to quality. It specifies who's ultimately responsible for the system, and it also specifies a few other key roles in the system that need to be identified and assigned to appropriate individuals. It also clarifies who's appropriately qualified for these roles, including requiring that they have the appropriate stature or influence and authority within the firm. And what that does is reinforce that these are key roles that need to be assigned to the right people within the firm to be able to deliver consistent quality. The standard also looks to ensure that individuals have an open channel of communication with those who have the ultimate responsibility for the system. And it addresses some of the actions and behaviours that are expected of leadership, making sure that they demonstrate a commitment to quality. There are also new requirements that are designed to hold leadership accountable for their roles. And that includes an explicit requirement for the periodic performance evaluations of leadership, and a requirement that at least annually, the individual with ultimate responsibility, and by that we mean the CEO or the CEO equivalent, evaluates and concludes on the effectiveness of the system of quality management and whether it's achieving its objectives. So some quite clear expectations of firm leadership in setting and delivering quality management. In addition to leadership, the standard takes a stronger stance on culture, and it explicitly requires that the firm demonstrate a consistent commitment to quality through its culture, and that same commitment to quality is then cascaded throughout the firm. One aspect of that is the firm's role in serving the public interest. That's a key aspect of culture, and it's a reminder of the firm's responsibility to consistently perform quality engagements when setting the tone throughout the organisation. We also recognise that the system of quality management can't operate in isolation from the firm's operational activities. It's not in a silo somewhere, it's ingrained in the firm's operation. So operational decisions about things like hiring, resources, IT, may have a very direct impact on the firm's ability to deliver quality assignments and on the system of quality management. So in order to be effective, the quality management system needs to be integrated with the firm's operational decisions and processes, and be an essential element when decisions are being made about the operations of the firm, and including decisions about the firm's strategy. So as part of governance and leadership, the standard addresses resource planning and financial resources, because quality needs to be front and centre of those resource considerations. Next slide, please. The next piece is the firm's risk assessment process, and this is absolutely fundamental. The task force and the board spent a lot of time on this. As I mentioned already, the risk-based approach, which is familiar from undertaking audits, was introduced to facilitate a proactive quality management approach, and also to allow the system to be tailored based on the nature and circumstances of the firm and the engagements it performs. The risk-based approach is incorporated in ISQM 1 through a number of new requirements in the component, the firm's risk assessment process, very aptly named. And that process basically encompasses three essential elements. Firstly, establishing quality objectives. And that means, what does the firm need to achieve in order to consistently manage the quality of its engagement? Secondly, identifying and assessing the quality risks. And that's really thinking about what could go wrong in achieving those quality objectives. And then designing and implementing responses. That's about the controls that the firm puts in place to address the quality risks that it's identified. The standard actually prescribes the quality objectives that the firm needs to have. Those quality objectives are prescribed in that way so that there's a consistent understanding across all firms about what needs to be achieved. Those prescribed quality objectives have been established for each component of ISQM1, with the exception of monitoring remediation, which we'll pick up later. And that's really because it's just a process rather than a separate component in that way. And as a result of prescribing the quality objectives, the quality objectives themselves essentially make up most of the requirements of ISQM1. So typically when we're speaking about the requirements, we're speaking about the required quality objectives. And we've got quality objectives rather than the required responses so that firms can have an outcome-based focus and be able to tailor those that focus so that the firms can set up the responses and so on with that outcome in mind. The standard does allow for the possibility that quality objectives don't cover absolutely everything that the firm needs to achieve, and the firm's circumstances may vary or something changes. So it does require the firm to establish additional quality objectives when needed. Now that may not happen very often, but the flexibility is there. Given the risk-based approach, identifying and assessing quality risks is a critical aspect of the firm's system, as it is very much when we're talking about planning and audit. So in undertaking the risk identification and assessment, the firm's required to understand the conditions, events, circumstances, actions or inactions that could adversely affect the achievement of the quality objectives. Now that's a lot of words, but in other words, it's really what are the things that could happen or not happen that could affect the achievement of the quality objectives. In order to give the firms a starting point to work from, the IAASB has included some conditions and events and circumstances and so on in the standard for firms to understand. But that's not intended to be an exhaustive list, it's just a starting point. And there's also not a long list of responses in ISQM1. Firms are expected to design and implement the responses that address the quality risks for that firm. We do have a few responses in where the IAASB believed it was necessary to specifically require those, and we'll cover those a little bit later. The standard also recognises that the firm's circumstances may change. There may be a need to modify quality risks and responses or add to them. And as a result, firms are required to put mechanisms in place to make sure that the information is identified that would drive a need for such a change. And I would say that COVID-19 is a perfect example of where we've all had to be doing that in practice. So we're going to perhaps take a brief stop there. That's an overview of the start of ISQM1 and the high level things. Pascal, I don't know if we have any questions that have come through.
So we have prepared questions, and we have other questions actually that are coming and that are sometimes quite similar. There is actually one question over COVID-19, because COVID-19 has quite changed the way of certain audit firms work now, with more use of IT and more use of technology. So the first question is, are there any further change that will come out of the result of a COVID-19 period? And were these standards designed as a consequence of COVID?
Well, I think as I started off, the standards certainly weren't designed as a response to COVID because the work was in train. But I think the quality management approach really is designed to build in the kind of flexibility that we've had to exercise over the last year. And it's talking about the risks to quality and so on. So I don't think we anticipate there being additional changes because of COVID-19, because I think that fits very strongly into the existing structure, or the structure we have now. And firms are very much considering about what are the risks to quality that COVID has presented, how has that changed what was there previously, and how do they change what they do, whether it's in relation to their own quality or dealing with clients or the risks of having staff working at home and so on. So hopefully that answers the question. I don't think we envisage changes, but it very much has the flexibility to deal with that. Natalie, do you want to add anything there?
I think you answered that perfectly. Thanks.
And somebody's asking whether it relates only to auditing and assurance, or it it relates also to other type of activities that firms may have, like tax advisory or training.
So the scope relates to assignments that are covered by the IAASB standards. So that's the audit assurance, compilations, reviews, agreed upon procedures, and so on. So the examples that you've given are possibly not likely to be covered, although I do know that in some, in some organisations you will have assurance assignments being delivered through perhaps the tax consultancy side. So one of the things that firms are having to do is consider very carefully what services are being provided through the various structures that they have. There's also probably a broader piece there, which is in relation to the firm's operations, something like training, although probably the provision of training to clients may not be an assurance service and therefore covered. The provision of training to the firm's personnel is probably a key part of the responses to risk, and therefore that will be part of that. Natalie, feel free to.
Thank you. Natalie?
Great, yeah, and I think just to emphasize some of the points that Sue made in the presentation, just around how there's the broader impact on the firm when you're looking at the culture elements, that this isn't just a silo. This is something that is really integrated with the firm's operations, so definitely has the potential to impact a lot of other aspects of the firm, such as the IT function and the human resources function that are not typically involved in performing engagements. They definitely will have a role to play in helping implement many aspects of the system.
Thank you. There are also a number of questions for small and medium practices. And I have some questions like, have you standards that will be issued only for small practices, or how scalable is going to be these quality management standards?
Sue, would you like to go first, or I'm happy to go first?
Natalie, I'm happy for you to kick off on this one.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Sue. So I think certainly ISQM 1 was designed to be scalable for all firms. So as Sue mentioned, I think earlier on in the presentation, the notion of that in larger firms, they need to scale up, but smaller firms may need to scale down. So how the standard has really been designed is that focus on achieving the quality objectives, which are outcome-based, and then firms thinking about what are the risks in their circumstances, and then designing responses to address those risks. So that's really where the tailoring comes in, and firms, a smaller firm would have risks and responses that would probably look very different from a larger firm. So that's really how we've embedded that scalability into ISQM 1. We've also embedded it in other ways. So for example, Sue mentioned monitoring and remediation, which we'll get to in a minute, that although the requirements kind of set out the process, how the firm goes about implementing those requirements would differ depending on the size of the firm. So it's really, about the firm exercising that professional judgment and looking at their circumstances and looking at the types of engagements they perform, and then working out where those risks are and what responses make sense in their environment. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there about scalability of the standard itself. There's a lot of examples. There's more support material that's coming out that will have more examples as well. And I know, for example, some of the professional bodies are also looking at providing more in the way of local guidance for particular types of practice.
Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you very much, Natalie. I think we need to move on to the next session. We've got a very precise timeline here. So Natalie, could you continue on resource information and communication and monitoring and remediation, please?
Sure, thank you, Pascal.
Thank you.
Great. So moving on to resources. So if we take a look at the current ISQC 1 standard today, it was obviously developed in a world pre-technology, or when technology wasn't as significant. So the standard today is very focused on human resources at the engagement level. So this was an area where we really identified a need to improve how the standard addresses all types of resources that a firm may need to operate the system or to perform engagements. So with that, we've introduced 2 other types of resources in addition to human resources. We've introduced technological resources and intellectual resources. So when we talk about technological resources, we're talking about things that the firm might need to operate the system. So that could be something, for example, to help monitor independence or track staff time or do some types of monitoring activities. Technology at the engagement level, so that would be an audit tool or any types of automated tools and techniques that the engagement team may need to use. And then there's also the IT that's needed to support and enable the operation of those IT applications. So whether that's personnel needed, for example, a laptop as they go out on engagements to be able to operate those IT applications. So that's what we mean by technological resources. When we talk about intellectual resources, we mean things, for example, a methodology, or guides or checklists and so on. So really the notion is that the firm needs to take that view and consider what resources are needed in these circumstances, so to be able to operate the system and engagements, and then of course obtain those resources and make sure that they are appropriately maintained and implemented. So those are the 2 new pieces that we've introduced in the standard. We, of course, have retained the human resources piece, but we have also further enhanced the human resources from what exists in the standard today. So one of the areas that we've done is we've really improved the focus on the need for human resources across the system and across engagements, whether or not those resources are obtained from external sources or they internal sources. So in other words, in some instances, the firm may need human resources from external parties in order to be able to assist them in operating the system or in performing engagements. So this would also include, for example, situations where the firm is performing a group audit and may need the assistance of component auditors. Those component auditors would be a resource to the firm because they're part of the engagement team. As I've mentioned, the resources may come from within the firm or they may come from external sources. And when we're talking about external sources, it really could be one of 2 things. So it could be coming from somewhere within the firm's network, if the firm is part of a network, or it could be a resource coming from a third party. And in that instance, we refer to them as service providers throughout ISQM1. And what ISQM1 does is when you're obtaining a resource from a service provider, it really drives firms to stop and think about whether those resources are actually appropriate for use for what they will be used for, not just really blindly relying on the fact that the resource is appropriate. We really want firms to stop and think about whether that resource is okay to use. The standard does also deal with resources coming from networks, but we deal with that in a separate section of the standard, and Sue will touch on that a little bit later. So moving on to information and communication. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So information and communication is not something that's really comprehensively addressed in the current standard today. So this is also something that is a new area that we have addressed. And of course, the continual flow of information and communication is a very essential element of any system to be able to enable that system to operate and engagement teams to perform the work on the engagements. ISQM1 recognizes that gathering information and communicating is not just something that the firm does. It really takes everyone in the firm to participate and cooperate. So all the people and engagement teams and leadership, everyone really has a role to play in making sure that the information is flowing to the right people at the right time. So what we've done is really emphasize and underscore the importance of that continual flow of information by linking the exchange of information to the firm's culture. We've also introduced a new requirement in the standard for the firm to have an information system. So this would be the process that the firm needs to implement to be able to identify and capture and process and maintain any information that's needed. And although this is something that is new in ISQM1, firms probably already have somewhat of an information system in place today. and already have their communication mechanisms already developed. So this is really, driving firms to take that step back and think more about what or how things need to be communicated, and then obviously making sure that that's implemented to enable the system to operate. So that's really focused on kind of the internal aspect of the information and communication. The other piece that we've dealt with in communication is communication with external parties, because of course over the last number of years there's been quite an evolution in terms of how firms and auditors communicate externally with stakeholders. We certainly acknowledge that firms may communicate through a variety of mechanisms. So firms may use transparency reports or audit quality reports, but they also may use other mechanisms such as a website or more direct communication with clients to communicate about the system. So we haven't really prescribed how firms communicate or what they need to communicate, because we do definitely recognize that across the world there's different needs and different stakeholders that firms may need to communicate with. However, for audits of listed entities, this was an area where we felt that this was really important, that firms are transparent with those charged with governance of those listed entities about the system, because that information is very important to those charged with governance to be able to fulfill their oversight role. So we have introduced a requirement there for the firm to communicate with those charged with governance about the system, and how and what that would look like is dependent on the circumstances. So we have provided the flexibility there. For all other circumstances, of course, we really want to encourage proactive communication. And so how we've gone about this is establish a requirement for firms to develop policies and procedures that address if and when communication is needed with external stakeholders. And of course, those policies and procedures would then also address what's contained in that information, what's the form of communication, the frequency, and so on. So there is a lot of flexibility there for the firms to develop what's appropriate and what makes sense in their circumstances. Of course, if there is law and regulation that stipulates what communication requirements, for example, there might be laws and regulations that require transparency reports. Of course, firms would need to comply with those. But from an ISQM 1 perspective, it's driven through the firm establishing the policies and procedures. So, of course, it's very possible that some firms may actually conclude that no communication is needed, but at a minimum, they would at least have needed to have considered and determined that. So moving on to monitoring and remediation, so that we can go to the next slide, please. Great, perfect, thank you. So of course, a key element to any system is the monitoring and remediation, because that is really the mechanism that tells the firm, whether the system is working and what needs to be fixed and where efforts need to be focused. So it really is important to that notion of proactivity and continual improvement, which Sue mentioned earlier on in the presentation. Of course, monitoring and remediation is something that is addressed in extant ISQC 1. However, in ISQM 1, we really have made this a lot more robust and really modernized this area of the standard. So for starters, one of the things we've done is we've really shifted the focus from engagement level monitoring to monitoring the system as a whole. Now, the firm really determines what that would look like and what those monitoring activities would be. So the nature, timing, and extent of those monitoring activities is driven by a number of factors. And we do address some of those factors in the standard. So for example, what might affect the monitoring activities is the circumstances of the firm. So for example, geographical dispersion of the firm. Other things that might affect it is, for example, where there's been areas of changes in the system. So the firm might want to focus on those. When they're monitoring, there might be information available to the firm about areas of the system that they need to focus on. There's a number of things that could really drive what those monitoring activities look like and where the firm needs to focus its efforts. So it really is intended to be scalable and tailored to the firm based on the circumstances. We have retained the requirement for firms to inspect completed engagements and for the firm to select engagement partners on a cyclical basis. So that requirement is still there. However, we have made improvements in this area to really focus that selection based on a number of factors as well. So for example, what other monitoring activities the firm has undertaken, where's there areas of risk, how is the system be designed. All of these things may affect how the firm goes about selecting engagements and engagement partners. So with all of this monitoring, of course, there would be information that the firm has as a result of those monitoring activities. And what we've done is we've introduced a new framework for the firm to evaluate those findings from the monitoring activities in order to identify deficiencies and evaluate the severity and pervasiveness of those deficiencies. So the framework really aims to help walk firms through that process of synthesizing that information that's coming from their monitoring in determining whether those deficiencies exist and how severe and pervasive they are. Of course, whether there's deficiencies and the severity and pervasiveness of those deficiencies really drives the remediation that the firm needs to undertake, and how urgently the firm needs to remediate those deficiencies would obviously very much depend on how severe and pervasive they are. Part of this framework is a new requirement for the firm to investigate the root cause of identified deficiencies. And of course, this is something that's very important because it's not very helpful to fix the symptom, so to fix the deficiency, unless you've actually really fixed the cause. So that was really the thinking behind introducing that requirement. We've developed this requirement, though, in a way that is intended to be flexible for firms. So the expectation isn't necessarily that a rigorous exercise needs to be undertaken each time there is a deficiency. Of course, in some situations, it might be very obvious what the root cause was, but in other circumstances, the firm might have to undertake a more rigorous exercise to work out that root cause. Of course, the more larger a firm gets and the more complex it becomes and more engagement teams out there, the more effort may be needed to work out the root cause. Just to touch on remediation as well. So this is another area we've improved in the standard. Currently in the standard today, it is a bit more prescriptive and kind of lists some of the remedial actions a firm might take. In ISQM 1, we've adjusted that. We've made it a much more principles-based approach. In addition to that, we have also introduced a requirement for leadership to also make sure that those remedial actions that have been designed actually have been implemented and actually are working effectively. So all of this information from the monitoring and remediation about the deficiencies and about the severity and pervasiveness of the deficiencies, what remedial actions have been undertaken, how effective those are, all of this information becomes very important to the person who has ultimate responsibility for the system, because of course that individual is required to undertake an annual evaluation of the system to determine whether it is actually achieving its objectives. And that really is an important requirement because it drives home that accountability of leadership for the system. So of course they would use all of that information coming from the monitoring there to make that evaluation. So I'm just going to pause there for an opportunity for any questions before we move on.
Thank you, Natalie. We do have a lot of questions that are arriving. You can see probably them on the question and answer. A lot of the questions are about documentation, software, guides, etc., etc. And I would like to leave those questions to the end, because I think there is a session about materials, and probably we should leave that to these questions. I'd like to focus on a couple of things. Number one, still, small and medium practices, they're a bit concerned about how they're going to apply those standards. For instance, if you're a sole practitioner and you just have a number of staff, how are you going to do the review that are not in that standard, but in the second one? So how independent also these monitoring process have to be from the engagement partner, etc., etc. So I think there's a lot of worries about how are we going to implement the standards.
Great, thank you, Pascal. I think just from a monitoring and an independence perspective, from a monitoring angle, the standard does actually deal with that. So we've dealt with it in a way that the firm establishes the policies and procedures themselves to deal with the objectivity of the individuals who are performing the monitoring activities. So of course, the firm would then think about whether there's any threats to their objectivity and then implement any safeguards that need to be implemented to deal with those threats. Having said that, though, we have retained a requirement that existed in the standard today around the individuals that actually perform the inspections of completed engagements, that they are not a member of the engagement team. So that is actually the same as what we have today. But we've really just kind of then expanded the notion that in relation to other types of monitoring activities, that's more for the firm to decide what the policies and procedures need to be in place there and what safeguards could be put in place if there is a threat to that independence. Sue, I don't know if you have anything further to add.
Well, I was just going to say, Pascal, it's that requirement is not substantially different to what we have now, and we see some very interesting practical ways in which smaller practices are addressing the monitoring requirements, whether it's working with service providers or training providers, working with other firms of a similar size so that you get that kind of independent cross review. There's a lot of different alternatives, I think, to or ways in which firms can learn and achieve that objective while while still recognizing the size of the organization.
Thank you. I know it's also not the topic of the standard for less complex entities today. However, we do have questions on how these practice management standards will relate to the standard to come. Any views on this? Sue?
I'm happy to kick off. We are just about to look at the less complex entity standard at the upcoming board meeting, so I'm partway through reading through all of that. The LCE, the proposed LCE standard, does work on the basis that firms are applying ISQM 1, so they are already applying the quality management systems, and it looks at things like ISO 220, the engagement partner responsibilities, through the lens of a less complex entity. But the expectation is that ISQM 1's applied.
Thank you very much. I wonder whether we could start talking about regulators right now. Maybe just one question on regulators, and then we will continue. I think one of the issues that we have to deal with in the coming 2 years is actually the adoption of the standard, because many countries have adopted ISS and ISQC1 and nominally. So basically, you would see in the audit law, ISQC1 is mandatory. So they will need to do that. What support and what training are available for regulators from IAASB or IFAC? Is there anything specific for them? And maybe to add on this question, what were the conversation you had when you established that standard with regulators? Because I'm sure you had some.
Absolutely, we certainly did, and they were part of the outreach activity when we were shaping all of this. I think it's also important to say the IAASB has a number of regulators on the board. So, and we also had a regulator was one of the observers for the ISQM1 task force. And actually, I think Natalie, I'm right in saying that ISQM2 was chaired by a regulator. So we have, a lot of very detailed involvement there. We also have interaction with IFIAR, which is the independent forum of independent audit regulators. So there's a lot of engagement there, and I know from my own involvement with IFIAR that this is a very regular topic. They have been tracking this all the way through and are extremely interested in how firms are applying it and how it will impact their work. So I think there's been a lot of ongoing dialogue, and I'm sure there will continue to be.
Thank you, Sue. Natalie, have you anything to add?
No, I think just to echo Sue's, what Sue already said, we did have a lot of regulator involvement. I mean, ISQM1 was developed over a number of years. So we did have task force members coming and going. And along the way, we generally always had a regulator very involved in the task force. So definitely got that input as we developed the standard. And I think just from the second part of the question around the implementation support materials, we'll touch on those at the end, but certainly the intent of those is that they can be used by all stakeholders and not just by practitioners. So all of the videos and materials that we're doing, we hope are also useful to regulators to understand kind of some of the implementation, the practical implementation perspective of the standard.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Thank you, Sue. Now I'd like to ask Sue to present network and other aspects, please.
Thank you very much. So just to speak about the firm's responsibility when it uses a network. Networks was one of the key public interest issues that we looked to address as part of this project. As I said before, we know that networks come in different shapes and sizes, but for most networks, there is some form of service that's provided and that member firms use. So for example, an audit methodology or an IT tool or a policy manual, those kinds of things. Sorry, I realized I hit stop on my video by mistake. So the public interest concern was really that while it was okay for firms to use these tools or policies, there does need to be a consideration of whether they are appropriate and suitable for the firm and whether they need to be adapted in the circumstances. So not just blind reliance on what the network gives you. That said, the IAASB is very strongly of the view that the firm itself is ultimately responsible for their own quality management system. The network itself is not responsible for the firm's system. So while there is a section on network requirements and services in ISQM1, it's very much focused on what the firm should do if it's using something from the network. So recognising the firm's responsibility. And the standard follows an approach whereby the firm looks to understand what it is that they're getting from the network, determines the effect of that item on the firm's system of quality management, and determines whether the item needs to be adapted or supplemented to be appropriate for use. So, for example, within my network, we have a global audit methodology, which is provided from the network. And then the member firms look to determine the extent to, or how that needs to be used and implemented, and whether it needs to be adapted and supplemented. So, for example, the methodology is based on the ISAs, but there may be local auditing standards or local laws of regulations that have additional requirements that an individual firm needs to layer into the network's methodology. Another important aspect introduced for networks is the requirement for the firm to understand the network's monitoring activities that are undertaken across the entire network. Monitoring might be different forms in different networks, but it's part of considering consistent application of network requirements and services, and that's important when you're working with firms, other firms within the network. So that includes understanding what the network is doing to determine that network requirements or policies and procedures are being appropriately implemented by all member firms. So the underlying concept is really that network requirements drive consistency and quality, and it's important that the network is checking on that and that the firm is aware of how the network is monitoring it. So although there aren't any direct requirements on networks in ISQM1, we do anticipate that there will be an impact at network level, and as somebody who works at network level, I can very much vouch for that as member firms adopt ISQM1. And that's because firms will need their networks to provide more information, and the impact is going to be more significant where there's more wide-scale use of network requirements or services. What we're also seeing is that firms, irrespective of the size of the network, are sharing best practice as they work towards implementation. So there is an element of sharing learnings that are going on. a lot of back and forth between member firms and the network. So I think for those of you that are members of a network, there will be a lot of interaction there. Next slide, please. This slide is really just to touch on a couple of other aspects to draw your attention to on engagement performance and relevant ethical requirements. There are two other components of ISQM1. And I think in the spirit of reinforcing the importance of professional skepticism, ISQM1 includes a quality objective in the engagement performance component that engagement teams exercise appropriate professional judgment and professional skepticism. So, for example, thinking about firm providing for consultation, for if there are differences of opinion, if the engagement team needs inputs on judgment. And that emphasises the firm's role in supporting engagement teams in making judgments and exercising professional skepticism at the engagement level. And there's a direct link between ISQM1 and ISQM2 on engagement quality review. ISQM1 contains the requirement for identifying which engagements are to be selected for engagement quality review. And then ISQM2 deals with the selection of the engagement quality reviewer and the performance and documentation of the review. And we'll cover that in a minute. And then for ethical requirements, there's a separate component there, given the fundamental nature of the ethical elements. And the standard's taken probably a more principles-based approach than the current ISQC1 standard. It deals with, as well as those internal to the firm, it deals with people who are external to the firm, such as network firms or service providers, and the need for the firm to incorporate appropriate policies or procedures to address the relevant ethical requirements that affect those external people, so the service provider. And the objective there is really for everybody involved in the system of quality management or involved in engagements to make sure that they are applying the appropriate ethical requirements, recognising that they may be different depending on the role or how you interact with the firm. So they may be far more extensive for those who are provided services for listed entities, but perhaps less so for a service provider where the interaction is far more limited. So a principles-based approach. So a couple of small elements there. I think we've got a short break for questions. Pascal, if there's anything that's come through while we've been speaking.
Yes, I would actually have a question about networks and how we should conceptualize networks, because we all know the big networks, who they are. But similarly, in a number of countries, the profession as a network provider for many things, methodologies for auditing, an example file of audit. So my understanding is that the responsibility for quality reside with now the firm, and the firm has to manage all these elements that are coming and make their mind as to whether these elements are sufficient or they need to put more elements into place for their quality management. Maybe that's my question.
And I think your summary is absolutely correct. And part of what the firm will be doing when they're working out what material to acquire is be thinking about how they what the risks are to quality and how the provider, and in your example, the professional body, is making sure that what is being provided is of the quality and meets the objectives. So you would probably, as part of your purchasing decision, be thinking about, well, how has this been developed? Who has had input into the material, and so on, to make sure that it is a robust process. Your example of something developed by the professional body may be very different to something that is provided by I don't know, my friend around the corner. So I think those kind of questions that we want people to be thinking about, and it's very much the case in terms of IT as well. what's the process to make sure that the IT is robust and will be sufficient for the requirements? Natalie.
Thank you, Sue. Natalie, anything?
No, nothing further to add. I think Sue's addressed that question. So.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we need to move on to ISQM 2. Natalie, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Pascal. Okay, so the next piece we were going to focus on was ISQM 2, which is also part of the suite of the standards at the firm level. If we could move on to the next slide, if possible, please. Great, perfect, thank you. So as we've mentioned, ISQM 2 is a brand new standard to the suite of the quality management standards, and it deals with engagement quality reviews. And although ISQM 2 is a brand new standard, many of the requirements that exist in the standard were relocated from ISQC 1 and ISO 220, which are the standards in place today. However, of course, as we have also further enhanced many aspects of ISQM 2 in the new standard. There is still a piece of engagement quality reviews that remains in ISQM 1, because of course an engagement quality review is one of the responses that a firm would actually put in place to address the quality risks. So the piece that still remains in ISQM 1 is the piece that deals with which engagements or when engagements need to be subject to an engagement quality review. And it's very similar to what we have in the standards today, where it's about the firm designing their policies or procedures for which engagements should be subject to an engagement quality review. However, we have added more I can't say that word. We have been more specific about the engagements that qualify. So like the standard today, it still applies to an engagement quality review is still required for audits of listed entities. And of course, an engagement quality review needs to be performed if it's required by law or regulation. However, the third piece that we've really enhanced here is the piece dealing with other engagements that the firm identifies that need to be subject to an EQ review. And this is far more focused on risks to really tie into that new risk-based approach. We have provided application material in the standard suggesting the types of factors or engagements that may drive which engagements it may be appropriate to perform an engagement quality review for. So this deals with things, for example, complexity or judgment, where there's been issues encountered with those engagements, or entities where there's some sort of public interest or public accountability considerations. Of course, it's very possible that some firms may have no engagements that qualify for an engagement quality review under the firm's policies or procedures, in which case, of course, then if there's no engagements that need an EQ review, then of course ISQM 2 would not apply in that situation. But of course, that's dependent on the firm's policies or procedures and what engagements they're performing at the time. So that's quite an important scalability point there, that engagement quality reviews are not always required, and ISQM 2 may not be applicable for some firms, depending on what engagements they perform. So if we focus on ISQM 2, so ISQM 2 deals with essentially three components. It deals with the appointment and the eligibility of the engagement quality reviewer, the performance of the review, as well as the documentation of the review. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So one area that we really enhanced with respect to engagement quality reviews is the objectivity of the engagement quality reviewer. Of course, being objective is a very essential part of performing an engagement quality review and being independent when you're challenging the engagement team's judgments and conclusions. So we have introduced a new requirement there for a 2-year cooling off period for an engagement partner before he or she may serve as an engagement quality reviewer. Other aspects that we've dealt with under the qualifications is making sure that the person performing the EQ review actually has enough time to do the review. And this is something that we really have enhanced in the standard, not only in the qualifications that they have time, but also throughout the performance requirements, that engagement quality reviewer is coming in at appropriate points in time throughout the engagement, really to make sure that they're not coming right at the end and making it very difficult for the engagement team then to appropriately respond to any comments or feedback that they might have. So that is something that we've really enhanced in the standard. We also have acknowledged that, of course, the firm may need to obtain an engagement quality reviewer externally if there's not an appropriately qualified individual within the firm. So, of course, if that's coming from a third party, that would be a service provider that we've already mentioned in the presentation. There also may be situations where the engagement quality reviewer may need assistance to assist them with performing the review, and that's also something that we've recognised in the standard as well. With regards to the performance and the documentation of the engagement quality review, we have provided further clarity on the meaning of significant matters and significant judgments in the application material. We've also, as I've mentioned, placed more focus on the timing of the review and when that's performed to make sure that's happening at the right time. And we've also introduced a stand-back requirement for the engagement quality reviewer just to reflect on whether they actually have complied with all of the requirements of ISQM 2. So very often the firm would have policies or procedures for the engagement quality reviewer in terms of what they need to do. But in addition to that, we've introduced this requirement that the engagement quality reviewer also just reflects back on the standard itself and makes sure that they've fulfilled all of those requirements. And then, as I've mentioned, there's also much more clarity around the documentation requirements for an engagement quality review, and that's another key enhancement in the standard. So I'll just pause there for any comments. Were we going to get to questions now, or I think Pascal?
I think we were just going to keep moving, Natalie, if that's okay.
Perfect.
Yes.
I'm going to hand over to Sue. Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, if we can go on to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk about ISO 220 revised and some of the key features. Just a reminder that this is the standard that is focused at the engagement level as opposed to the other material we've been speaking at a firm level primarily. So ISO 220 revised makes it very clear that the engagement partner has overall responsibility for managing and achieving quality on the audit on the individual engagement. And as we talked earlier about culture in relation to the firm and the need to make sure that culture is happening at the engagement level and that the right environment is created on an individual engagement to deliver quality. So ISO 220 revised requires an emphasis in the engagement team on the firm's culture and the expected behaviour of the engagement team members to flow through from firm level to individual engagements. And what does that look like? Well, it's really about the responsibility for all team members for quality, the importance of professional ethics, emphasising the role in serving the public interest, the values and attitudes that are expected, and the importance of professional skepticism to a quality audit. So those kinds of really deep behaviours that are important to quality. Like ISQM 1, ISO 220 revised now covers the broad range of resources, not just human resources, and the engagement partner has the responsibility to make sure that the resources as a whole are sufficient and appropriate. If they're not sufficient and appropriate, then the engagement partner needs to take action, including communicating with the firm to make sure that they get sufficient and appropriate resources. Now, this is one of those areas where scalability is important. Within a small firm, the resource discussion may be a simple exercise about looking at the staff planner and the allocation of resources. In a larger firm with a complex client with very complex specialist needs, there may be a much more in-depth discussion about making sure that the appropriate specialist input is achieved. So scalability has been built into ISO 220 revised as well. ISO 220 revised requires the engagement partner to take responsibility for the direction and supervision of the engagement team and the review of their work. That direction, supervision and review needs to be tailored to the nature and circumstances of the audit and to the resources of the audit. And again, from a scalability perspective, if there's a small team or it's a one-person team, that direction and supervision element may be less complex, it may be not applicable. If it's a large team, then the engagement partner will probably be spending a lot of time looking at how to take responsibility for that direction, supervision, review, how that's planned, how that's executed throughout the engagement. The standard also clarifies what the engagement partner needs to review. And in brief, that's the significant matters, significant judgments on the audit. And the engagement partner also needs to review the formal written communications to management, to those charged with governance, and any regulatory authorities if that applies. And we mentioned, or Natalie mentioned, a stand back for the engagement quality reviewer in ISQM 2. Well, ISA 220 revised has got an important stand back provision at or near the close of the audit for the engagement partner. And that requires the engagement partner to determine that they've done enough to take overall responsibility for managing and achieving quality on the engagement. And that includes things like whether or not they were involved in a sufficient and appropriate way to take that overall responsibility. That stand back requirement is new, and it was considered by the board to be a really important revision to ISA 220. That, I think, provides our final break for questions, Pascal, if there's anything more.
Yes, thank you. So I think I'm going to focus again on the very small practitioners. If you are a sole partner, an engagement partner, how do you deal with the quality review? So that's one question. I would follow up by how many does that review needs to be annual or pluriannual? And there was also a question is, with these framework in place, what is the minimum numbers of employee you need to have?
So Sue, do you want me to kick off? So I think there was a couple of things built into that question. So in terms of the review, so there's a couple of different types of reviews that are being dealt with in ISQM 1 and ISQM 2. So there's the engagement quality review piece that we just covered, and of course that's the monitoring of the actual the reviews that are being performed at the engagement level. So it really would depend on the firm's policies or procedures in terms of which engagements those policies and procedures require an engagement quality review for. And of course, that's developed based on whether, if the firm is performing audits of listeds or whether there's law and regulation that require an engagement quality review. Of course, then the firm would need to do that. In the case of a sole practitioner in that situation, of course, as we've mentioned, the engagement quality reviewer needs to be objective. So the firm may need to go and seek resources externally to, if they have engagements that are qualifying for an engagement quality review there. I think the other element I heard in the question there was also there's the review where firm leadership performs an evaluation of the system. I wasn't sure if that was an element being dealt with in that question. So that's the stand back where the person with ultimate responsibility evaluates whether the system is effective, and that is required on an annual basis. But that's the kind of overall review of evaluation of the system. So I think, Sue, was there anything further you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, I think there was a question about the minimum number of employees, and the standard, the standards have been drawn up to recognise that you have sole practitioners, so it could be a one-person operation, but in that situation, there may be a need to look at some kind of external service provider or what have you for something like the quality monitoring. The decision as to what kind of clients to act for, as Natalie mentioned, would be what drives the need for quality reviewers. And I think it would probably be unusual for a one-person operation to be looking at things that need a quality reviewer. But those are the kinds of considerations. So I mean, we very much recognise there are one-person operations that that operate very effectively, and that think around the risks to their business and how they address those risks.
Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you very much, Natalie. Before finishing the Q&A, and there are a couple of questions on documents that would help the implementation of those standards, or actually tools. Because one of the question was, would it be possible to have quality management software, and would IFAC or WSB help to develop this? And they were saying, well, maybe that would help consistency of application. There was another question about, will there be a guide to implement these standards? So I'll leave you actually respond through the next presentation, Natalie. And I'm going to stop here. I'd like to thank all the participants because I will not talk after you. I would like also to thank our development partners, that is the European Commission, the Austrian Ministry of Finance, the Austrian Development Agency, that help us with many programs, with the Georgia Financial Inclusion and Accountability Project, the project for GRAIN, the project for the South Caucasus and the Black Sea, StarUp, and the new program Repairs for SMEs. These are the programs at the CFRR that help us to bring this event to life. And I would like to thank all the partners and also the staff that is behind this operation. Thank you very much. Thank you, Natalie. The floor is yours. It was my pleasure.
Great, and thank you, Pascal, and thank you for also hosting us today. It's really been great that we're able to share this material with everybody. I think if we can just share the last slide. Great, thank you. So just we've had, as Pascal mentioned, we've had a lot of questions, I think, coming through on the implementation support materials. We are planning to release some first-time implementation guides for all three standards. The guides for ISQM 1 and ISQM 2 will be released by the end of Q2. So by the end of June, those will be available. And they really focus on key areas of the standard and more complex areas, and also highlight where there's key changes. And I think Sue also mentioned earlier on in the presentation that they include examples as well. We've already released some fact sheets that are available on our website, this kind of 3-4 page documents that highlight the key changes. There was a video we launched in April, just kind of focusing on initial implementation efforts and what the firms may need to think about in terms of getting going on implementing the standards. And then we've also mentioned the 4-part webinar series that we announced yesterday, which will take a deep dive into the topics and really cover those in more detail. So we'll have the firm's risk assessment process, resources, monitoring and remediation, and then just general aspects of ISQM 1. And those will be happening over the course of June through to August. So please also join us for those. If you'd like to follow us on our social media, we announce all our work we're doing through our social media channels. We also have our YouTube channel where we have a number of videos available as well. And we have a dedicated webpage with all our quality management material, which is there on your slides. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Pascal, for hosting us as well. So over to you. I don't know if you have any further to add.
Simply to reiterate, thank you very much, and thank you for everyone for the questions. There's a lot of material we've been taking away. Natalie, I've just sent you a note about making sure we pass on some of the feedback, particularly on the small and medium-sized practices. So thank you, Pascal and IFAC for hosting this.
And thank you so much, Sue and Natalie. We do appreciate this unique opportunity to directly hear from you, and we'll be following the developments. And unfortunately, we do not have more time to take the questions today, but we will definitely review all questions and use them as an input to future webinars and implementation support materials. The standards become effective in less than 19 months. And we at the IFAC understand the challenges, but also see it as an opportunity for the accountancy profession and for the professional accountancy organizations that represented. Your knowledge, your experience, as well as relationships with regulators, government, academia, practitioners are essential in supporting country efforts to roll out these important standards and to champion audit quality overall. We encourage you to start planning now, and so that to have sufficient time to understand and adapt to these key changes. In our turn, over the coming months, IFAC is committed to supporting its members and their constituents via awareness-raising webinars such as this. We will also develop and disseminate support tools in collaboration with our partners, as well as articles and case studies on IFAC Gateway page to illustrate how implementation is being handled in various country contexts. We are also working on a dedicated IFAC webpage to bring the various pieces together in one place. And as we are doing that, we want to hear from you. IFAC Quality and Development Team, of which I am a member, are available to speak about adoption and implementation of the new standards, what it means to you in terms of retaining compliance with local requirements, compliance with the IFAC obligations, the SMOs, and we can put you in touch with contacts and partners to help you along the journey. Closing the meeting, I would like to once again extend our sincere appreciation to Sue and Natalie. I think we all agree that was a very informative and very useful session. Thank you also to our WorldBank and IFAC colleagues who made this event happen. And thank you all for your participation, for your time and good discussion. Please stay in touch and stay well. Thank you so much.